Today we've been speaking with Professor Mark Pilisuk. We've been speaking with Jennifer Rountree. They're authors most recently of The Hidden Structure of Violence, Who Benefits from Global Violence and War. And now we want to continue that conversation and also bring in Tara Dorabji. She is a writer, arts educator at YouSpeaks, mother and radio journalist at KPFA on Apex Express. Her work is published and is forthcoming in Teo Literary Magazine, Good Girls Marry Doctors, Center for Asian American Media, and Midwifery Today. And you can learn more about her work at dorabji.com, dorabji.com. And today, particularly, we're weaving into the conversation this very related issue. In the forthcoming Project Censored book, Censored 2016, Tara Dorabji and Susan Rahman wrote a piece exploring commonalities and experience of forms of resistance shared by women in Kashmir and Palestine, and noting that as storytellers, mothers, and organizers, women make up the backbone of these movements for sovereignty and independence. Dorabji and Rahman, in their chapter, detail the realities of life for women living under military occupation and explore how they have been instrumental in sustaining two independence movements that have suffered from grossly inadequate and or distorted coverage in corporate media. Tara Dorabji, you joined the conversation on the Project Censored Show.
Hey, Mickey. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure, Tara. Let's have you chime in. You've been listening to our conversation with Mark Pilisuk and Jennifer Rountree. Can you relate some of the things that we've been discussing to your own work, specifically the work that we just mentioned about the women in Occupied Palestine and Kashmir?
Yeah, I think that when you look at these deeply occupied zones with tremendous military force from around the globe, they're very critical in maintaining a narrative for U.S. hegemony. So, for example, when you look at the occupation of Palestine, that is directly related to the rise of U.S. hegemony post-World War II. And likewise, when you look at Kashmir, and Kashmir is the most densely militarized land on Earth. That's what really drew me to go out there and start doing field work and working with the people, is that there was this deep independence movement really pushing towards the concept and asking questions about what does independence look like beyond the nation state? What is freedom, really in this movement? And, it's a land where there's 700,000 Indian military and paramilitary. But I think what's really unique about Kashmir is that the occupation of Kashmir came out of the independence of India. So that, again, plays into a larger global narrative of India becoming liberated from colonialism, but the backstory of that is that the British carve up the subcontinent, create the largest human land migration in human history, a slaughter where millions died, and then create this really long-term feud, which is fueled by two nuclear nations over culturally independent areas. So I think that when we look at the larger narratives behind these deeply militarized zones, the purpose is really about creating a certain story that maintains and justifies U.S. hegemony. And I think, for me, investigating and looking at what are the stories of cultural resistance and the stories of women in Palestine and in Kashmir is that you have this narrative of both these places where the words terrorism, the words militants are thrown around, and then you have these images of women veiled, and in the Western media that veil is misused in horrific ways, and the real freedom of the way that women choose to dress is subverted and a lot of times justified. We're going into Afghanistan to liberate the women. We're going into these regions. The whole Israeli campaign where you have pictures of Israeli women on bus billboards saying, we've gone in there and we're liberating women. And so to go in and ask the women in these regions who are living daily under the military occupation, what is your story? What are you living for? What are you fighting for? And how was an incredible process.
So that's Tara Dorabji. She is joining us by phone. She's recently co-author with Susan Rahman of Women in a chapter in the forthcoming Project Censored book titled Existence is Resistance, Women in Occupied Palestine and Kashmir. And Mark Pilisuk and Jennifer Rountree, I was interested in sort of tying on running with some of the things that Tara just said, particularly on U.S. hegemony. In your book, The Hidden Structure of Violence, you have a chapter that talks about values and habits that maintain a violent system, and you actually have a segment. You have a segment here that talks about the Western worldview is a constellation of specific beliefs and values that appear reasonable and natural to those who carry them. And in the book, you say, we identify 15 assumptions of this dominant paradigm. Can you talk a little bit about what some of these are, this maintenance of hegemony? Do you want to address any of those things?
Well, I think that a lot of what we're talking about are those persistent Western myths that like to be perpetuated that really support this structure of violence.
Such as exceptionalism.
Right, exactly. And in spite of the fact that we have some poor health outcomes, we have the greatest number of incarcerated people compared to the rest of the world. And so really questioning our moral superiority. My personal favorite myth is, I think in the book we call it the moral rightness of competitive individualism, just about the self-made individual and just supporting the assumption that wealth is the result of hard work and therefore poverty is the result of not hard work, I guess.
Yeah, well, social Darwinism, Protestant work ethic, Horatio Alger, I mean, that's all riffing out of the Gilded Age, the 19th century, and that's certainly still with us.
It runs deep in our history. It takes a lot to, I think, disentangle all the ideas within that.
Mark Pilisuk, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in from the perspective of those voices that are confronting the dominant ideologies. And Tara has been really good about this, and so has Susan, and looking at the voices that don't get covered, but are amazingly strong given the conditions that these women are working under. It comes out in so many places, in some of the most dictatorial and authoritarian atmospheres. In Colombia, there's an amazing group of people who refuse to participate. They refuse to participate in the government. They refuse to participate in FARC. And they come together and just refuse to have soldiers come to their place. And in the same way, Black Lives Matter is upsetting the dialogue. The dialogue says that the government is there to monitor the safety of all of us, and the actual fact is that the police force is there to monitor the protection of those who have property. So it is amazing that we get these voices coming up. It's like the grass coming up through the concrete.
Tara Dorabji, let's bring you back in on that note. Talk to us a little bit more about, again, this resistance. And you heard Mark Pilisuk just saying that these are remarkable movements, people of great courage facing great adversity, but they're there, and they are working to create better situations, working against these cultures of violence.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm in complete awe and have so much respect for particularly the women. I had the opportunity to go into Kashmir and meet with some of the women, and I know Susan also went to Palestine and met with women there, and then we did a series of interviews and then came back together and brought some of our research findings together along with the work of other women who have been doing this work both in Kashmir and Palestine. So that's sort of where our research and findings came from. One of the women that Susan talked with, she just said, to resist is to exist. And it's not really a choice, right? You're there, you're in these deeply occupied moments. Your son could die. One of the women in Palestine, she lost her daughter to tear gas because the Israelis were testing and adding different chemicals into the tear gas, and she was exposed at a demonstration, and she died in the hospital from that. Just really profound moments, and I think that when we look at resistance, a lot of times the imagery we see it out, we see it militarized, we see the men on the front lines, and that is very much what's in the media, but behind that is the deeper backbone. And women really identify as culture keepers, just, keeping the language alive, keeping the tradition alive, keeping the stories of resistance within the communities, the songs. That's a huge part of the resistance movement in Kashmir is the traditional songs of resistance, the poem, and the women are really the keepers of these. And in addition, they are out organizing demonstrations against the wall or responding to the disappearances in Kashmir. There's been over 8,000 disappearances of men as a result of the occupation. And then there's also deeper types of resistance. One of the women that Susan talked to in Palestine, her act of resistance, her husband was incarcerated and he was serving a 25-year jail sentence, and she wanted to have a child with him, and she actually went in and got sperm and inseminated herself and had a child despite the fact that they're separated. And so I think that existence is resistance cannot be underestimated what that means. The men are taken away in these communities, whether it's that they're locked up, they're killed, disappeared, dumped into mass graves. The very machine is to stop it. And I think that another key point women really bear the brunt of is the sexual violence, and these military occupations use that as a tool of cultural control by raping the women and doing it on a massive scale where, in Kashmir it's unprecedented. It's 1 out of 7 Kashmiris surveyed have witnessed a rape. So the numbers are horrific, and so you're talking about the most intimate forms of domination and control, and to be able to subvert that when your husband, for example, is in prison and actually find a way to bring the next generation up, it's tremendously powerful and very humbling to be able to sit with the women. And many of them have been denied access to education as a result of the occupation. And so even having the language to be able to talk sometimes has to be done through translators. But that dedication to also keeping the culture alive and the tradition is incredibly powerful. And, just to kind of zoom out on the big picture from there, from very personal, and then you kind of bring it back to the larger machine. And the U.S. gives about $3 billion annually in military aid to Israel alone. And then what's interesting is, when you look at the numbers, just in between 2002 and 2008, India acquired $5 billion in arms from Israel to, quote-unquote, combat Islamic insurgents. And so you really see that money and that cycle of violence also coming directly back to the United States, and also cycling between these, and also then that larger narrative of these arms are about combating Islamic insurgents. And then when you go on the ground in the community, you meet these women, and they're living a peaceful life by any way that they can to preserve that for their families.
We're speaking with Tara Dorabji, a writer, educator, and journalist. She recently is co-author of a piece with Susan Rahman, Professor Susan Rahman from College of Marin. The chapter in the forthcoming Project Censored book, Censored 2016, is called Existence is Resistance, Women in Occupied Palestine and Kashmir. We're also joined by Mark Pilisuk and Jennifer Rountree, authors of The Hidden Structure of Violence, Who Benefits from Global Violence and War. I'm Mickey Huff with Peter Phillips. Today we are in conversation with Professor Mark Pilisuk and Jennifer Rountree. Their latest book, The Hidden Structure of Violence, Who Benefits from Global Violence and War. We're also joined by author, writer, journalist, educator Tara Dorabji, author with Susan Rahman of Existence is Resistance, Women in Occupied Palestine and Kashmir, chapter in the forthcoming Project Censored book. And we want to continue this conversation. Peter?
I'm looking at the listings here for identification of increasing fascism, and it plays right off what Tara was talking about, rampant sexism, control of mass media, obsessions with national security, the power of corporations is supreme, and avid militarism. Those symptoms of what we call fascism today are reflective of the values and habits that maintain a violent system. And in the book, 2 of those in particular are how private property is favored by law over unowned nature or public property, or what we call the commons, and that the resources of the world exist for the use or exploitation of those best able to take advantage of these gifts. So there's a mythology and a belief that that's appropriate. If you have the money, you have the power, you should be drilling for oil, you should be exploiting the resources in the world, and if people get in the way, too bad. and that ability to have that kind of control. And it's almost like it's justified. And that moves us in a direction of increasing privatization in a very big way, whether it's public education or the post office or even the military, with increasing use of mercenaries. That's an issue that we think is vital. Mark, could you talk a little bit about moving this direction of continued privatization and corporate power?
Well, one of the justifications for increasing privatization is economic growth. And the idea is that anything that produces an increase in the GDP is viable. And if it happens to be something that is producing something that's harmful for people, or producing something that will have long-term consequences that will have to be paid off in the future but don't have to be counted now, that those are all legitimate activities. And so we find, for example, that things that were once understood to be under control of the commons or under control of the rights of individual communities are now constrained by regulations that insist that they have to meet the standards of economic growth for the elite. And we see this now in the housing crisis particularly, but we see it also now dangerously in something that was once understood to be a right of sovereignty of governments. That was the right to conduct wars and to have a military. Now the question is that these governments obtain a degree of distance from their policies and from their activities by hiring contractors. The contractors are not necessarily different people. They are people who also slide in and out of government positions and use that position to be able to get contracts for the future for their corporations. But it removes the possibility of having any kind of accountability for the government for the atrocities that get committed.
Jennifer Rountree, let's bring you into the conversation on the same point. What would you like to add to this?
I was just thinking about a historical example about the Civil War in Guatemala. It was started by a nationalist movement that sought to redistribute the land to the people, and based on U.S. interests by companies like the United Fruit Company and other corporations, the oligarchy in Guatemala, of course, really turned the tables on the people and initiated this 30-plus year war, which ended up killing, hundreds of thousands, especially indigenous people that had a lot at stake in their continued existence in the country where they have lived for thousands of years. And so it's frightening to see history repeating itself a little closer to home. If I could hop in right there.
Tara Dorabji, yes.
After India's independence, Kashmir ended up going with India, sort of a quasi-independent relationship. And during that time when they were able to self-rule and India handled the borders, Kashmir was leading the world in revolutionary land reform. So that was really a broad redistribution of resources, and it created a population relatively equal in wealth. And so there was actually a land-to-tiller legislation, and close to 200,000 acres of land were transferred to about 150,000 people that were working the land. And no individuals could keep over 20 acres of land. And when I talked to the Kashmiris about it, one of the things that people told me in that story was that it was a peaceful transfer because it was seen as between the people. And, when you look at sort of the timing of that land redistribution and then the change in relationship between Kashmir, the capital Srinagar, and Delhi at the time, and sort of the erosion of trust and the deterioration of that relationship, a lot of it was happening around that. And I think as they became an example for land reform, other areas across India were looking towards them as an example, and you were starting to see that instituted, but with less peaceful results. And so I think that when we look at the type of deep militarization in certain parts of the world, the distribution of resources and wealth cannot be underestimated in how the people are approaching that.
That's Tara Dorabji, author, writer, educator, and she is author recently of a chapter on women in Kashmir and Palestine with Susan Rahman. Mark Pilisuk and Jennifer Rountree, and also we'll hear from Tara here. We have a few minutes left in the show here. And in The Hidden Structure of Violence, Who Benefits from Global Violence and War, Mark and Jennifer, you conclude the book by saying the challenge to contemporary patriots is to find the courage to guard our souls against pressures to accept a violent world and its promoters as inevitable. And then, of course, you cite some notables. You cite Ralph Nader. You cite pro-democracy groups from Burma, Iran, Haiti, in the Occupy, and so forth. So, Mark Pilisuk, let's just go and cut to it. What in the conclusion here? What are your hopes, and what are you hoping to achieve and move forward here?
One hope is that those people whose dissent takes the form of getting out in the street and yelling or banging on rooftops, that we understand that the first step in any kind of counter power to the elite is people finding voice. And if those activities give them a voice that they never had before, those are important, and they're not easily calculated under a game strategy calculation of what will be the outcome of a specific one, but they're inherently have great power, and it was part of the underlying power of what caused the revolution in South Africa. It wasn't people with real spears, it was people with wooden sticks and shouting and dancing and denying the legitimacy South African regime. The other thing I think that gives me hope is that I find that people are amazingly creative. Social scientists are terrible at forecasting the future. We're always good at analyzing it afterwards, and we never notice the power of social movements. And my hope is that as people see the way that the larger system operates, that there'll be increasing coalitions of groups that will work on the vulnerable points of those power elites.
Jennifer Rountree, how do you see this book helping in the work that you do with Native American groups?
I think particularly currently for American Indian and Alaska Native communities, I think it's helpful even to define poverty and structural factors brought to bear on communities as violence. We had a special task force this last year on violence and victimization in American Indian communities, and Native youth are exposed to violence disproportionately compared to white youth. But what's exciting and hopeful, I think, is there is a lot of movement around cultural identity as really being a source of protecting against these adverse childhood experiences and situations of violence. So there's a lot of youth movements actually around Indian country now that are about youth learning their native languages, connecting with elders in the community. A lot of these projects intersect with the food sovereignty movement as well, which of course also incorporates aspects of improving health, improving nutrition, and even economic development. So I find those very exciting.
And Tara Dorabji, we have about a minute or so left in today's show. Your conclusive remarks.
I just want to second what Mark said around the power of voice and personal transformation and how important that is, as Jennifer said, for our young people and being able to tap into their deep cultural identity, and specifically our young women here and around the globe, giving them the tools to unlock their voice and really becoming the active agents of social change. That's where our future is, creating a leaderful generation. And also, there's new pathways right now for young people, for all generations, to connect around the globe and really build this digital resistance, but that comes from voice and personal transformation.
That was Tara Dorabji. She's a writer and author, most recently of work on women in Kashmir. You can learn more about Tara's work at dorabji.com, Dorabji. Thank you so much, Tara, for joining the Project Censored Show today.
Thank you so much for having us and for getting the voices of Kashmiri and Palestinian women in this next volume of Project Censored.